We have to be very, very distinct on that. Sales methodologies are not sales process. They're tactics within the process to help advance the sale. Hey everyone, welcome to Driving Growth, the go-to-market podcast for traditional B2B businesses that are looking to build systems to create predictable revenue. In short, turning their company into a revenue factory. I'm Steve Whittington, and today we are going to be unpacking one of the most critical but undervalued, underappreciated elements of sustainable growth, a sales process that actually works. Not a vague funnel, not one-size-fits-all script. I mean a real, inspectable, buyer-centric system that helps your team close deals faster, with less waste, and more clarity so you know what you need to do to grow. Let's jump in. Okay, part one. The first thing you have to have clarity on, which doesn't seem like maybe you won't have clarity on it, is what is your revenue model? I have seen teams trying to go to market with two competing revenue models. So let's unpack what revenue models are. So the first thing is ownership. You sell something to somebody like a good, and then they own it. That's a revenue model, is you're selling ownership. The other one is subscription, where you're selling ongoing services that are repeatable and scalable. So you're selling subscription. You're selling access to a software, as an example, or rent would be a subscription. The last one is usage. So you're selling usage of something, which could be service, for instance, or you're renting a good for a set period. So you're selling usage. And you need to understand what is your revenue model for your sales funnel. Now, you could be a business that does selling of physical goods and renting of physical goods. That doesn't mean you're going to have the same sales process and the sales funnel for those two different types of revenue models. So you got to get clear and distinct on that so you can build specific funnels for both of those revenue models, if you so happen to have two. Okay, once that's level set and you understand the requirements, then you can move forward to the next section. All right, number two, understanding what your sales model is. Now, again, depending on your revenue model, depending on what you do, you could have several sales models, but you need to make sure that you understand them as to how they're going to fit into your sales funnel and your sales process. So your sales models are kind of simple. You have self-serve sales. Now, going back to the first comment about revenue model, if you have a rental, which is a usage revenue model, you may have the ability for people to book online to book a space to rent something. So that would be self-serve sales. The next one, though, is inside sales. And that's where you have a team that handles inbound lead management. And generally, that's for companies that have medium complexity and cost. But again, the rental one would work with that, where people are calling in to book a spot to see if something's available. Okay? So inside sales could be another one of your models. And then you might have to think about, well, we've got complex things and we're prospecting. You could have outside and field sales. And that's generally when you're prospecting bigger types of sales, and usually it's complex products with higher price points. And then the last type of sales model is channel sales. And that's when you're selling to third-party resellers. Classically, that can be retailers, dealers, or service providers that support your go-to-market. You need to know what your model is that lines up with your revenue model to be able to build your sales process. Now, keeping in mind, if you've got a couple of different revenue models and you have a couple of different sales models, you'll have to see how those interact and how you can build it into your sales process. The one we're going to be focusing on for an example today is channel sales. So typically, a manufacturer has retailers or dealers. That is their channel that they sell through. And we're going to give an example today of how to build a sales process for channel sales. But the overall methodologies apply to general sales process. All right, the next step. We've talked about revenue model. We've talked about your sales model. And now what happens is people often mistake or mix up sales methodologies with sales process. Now, what's the difference between a methodology and a process? So a process is a step-by-step guide as to what you have to do to move a prospect from, well, move an individual, a prospect, to a customer. Okay. A sales methodology is the techniques and tactics that you use within the sales process to help you close the deals. Now, you've probably heard of spin selling. You've probably heard of challenger sale. You've probably heard of solution selling. You've heard of BANT, that sort of stuff. Those are methodologies. And generally what organizations need to do is when they map out their sales process, they take elements of those methodologies and apply it within their sales process as playbooks or tactics that they do to help advance the sales. So we have to be very, very distinct on that. Sales methodologies are not sales process. They're tactics within the process to help advance the sale. All right, now let's move on to the next step. Now, before we get into defining a sales process and giving an example of doing a sales process for a typical manufacturer, I want to talk about what makes a sales process real. First off, you're going to have stages of your sales process, and all the stages have to be inspectable. You have to be able to document that something's happened for you to have a real sales process. But each stage of the process needs to have entry criteria. What is it that you need to do to get into that stage? You need to have a description of what's going to be occurring overall in that stage and what you're trying to achieve. And then you need to have requirements for your reps as to what they need to do in that stage to advance the deal. And lastly, there needs to be an exit criteria. How do you get out of that stage? So 4 things: entry criteria, description, requirements, and exit criteria. And that will allow you to document and make it inspectable. And you know that if you have all these different stages that have all 4 of those elements within them, you do have a real sales process. Now that's set the baseline. Now we're going to move on to an example of a sales process. So I'm going to give an example of there was a manufacturer, for confidentiality's sake, no names. We deal with manufacturers all the time. And we went and we did a sales audit. We looked at their sales process. We wanted to see different things that they had for different sales collateral, assets, that sort of stuff. And then we got into mapping what their sales process is. And really what that is that we have a discussion, we unpack what's currently being done, and then we try to frame it up with process and put different steps in place and requirements so that you can have a standard operating system for your sales process, which you can optimize, and then you can have consistency, and of course, then you can learn from and be able to scale and add force and friction. And I'll get into force and friction a little bit later. So here's how it goes. We did this sales audit, and before they were operating mostly with the reps that were just bringing in on the end, so they'd get sales orders that come in, and we didn't know what was happening before. So there's no centralized tracking, no CRM, none of that stuff, not even a spreadsheet that's keeping track of all this kind of stuff. It's kind of like you get what you get, and you hope you don't get upset, because that's what's going on. So what we did is we wanted to understand the 2 main things that drove their business. Obviously, when you have a channel sales, you have a number of dealers, you have account management, so you'd have an account management funnel. But the other big part of growth is that's the retention side of the motion, is like your account management is how do you hang on to it and how do you grow it and expand it. But then you have the acquisition side of it. And so that we wanted to have a pipeline specifically for acquiring additional partners. Okay, so in this particular case, we came up with a few steps. So they wanted to put prospecting in there, and when the actual person, the prospect engaged, got to a product demo, stocking order, whether it was won, and then onboarding, on hold, and lost. Okay, so that's the stages that we started to map and to start to put in all the different 4 criteria for. Now, I've just said those stages. Those are clearly not from the buyer's perspective. That's just a very top level description. But what we did there is we mapped the journey that somebody that doesn't know about this manufacturer at all the way to the end, where they either of onboarding them and or lost them, right? And so I always like to have in sales processes, you can, for most of them, you can have on hold because people haven't quite made a decision yet, but they're not going to be committing within a certain amount of your sales cycle. So you don't want it to mess up your pipeline volume, that sort of stuff. And of course, you have to have lost because you need to understand your win rate. And then the other steps of your process come down to how you actually go about doing your business. So that's part of how you start building out the sales processes. You have a discussion with the sales leaders and really unpack what is it they're doing right now, and then how can we organize that, and then how can we optimize it, and how can we put criteria within those steps that they're doing right now so we can standardize it and have everybody follow the same thing. Hey, I just wanted to take a moment to remind you that everything we're talking about is available in our Revenue Factory Toolkit. Go to weareroadmap.com/podcast and find it there today. Download the mathematical models, download the deck with all this information, and start building your go-to-market system. Now let's get back to the episode. So once we went through all those steps and mapped out what they're doing now and then put the usual stuff in place, we then went back and we did the entry-exit criteria, the descriptions, and the requirements. And then we critically defined it from the buyer's point of view, not their internal point of view. The interesting thing about a lot of sales processes is they tend to forget the most important thing, the buyer. So you want to come back and think about, well, geez, rep sent proposal or proposal sent could be internal decision making, or demo is a classic stage where it could be buyer requested demo, stuff like that. You need to figure out what is it that they call it internally, and so that you can have that in your sales process, so it puts you more into the buyer's mindset as to what you're trying to do to solve for them. And you need to go back through your sales process and define everything from a buyer's perspective, so that's inputted into your sales process. What is it that they are trying to get out of each stage, not what you're trying to push in each stage? Okay, so we've gone through the boring mechanics, so to speak, of developing a sales process. And now here's the fun part. So you've thought about all the different steps that your team goes through to define a sales process. You've thought about entry, exit, and the requirements within it. And that's where you start to now think about what are the sales collateral that's needed. So, your reps can't advance conversations without tools. You got to think about, well, do we need product one-pagers? Do we need case studies? Do we need FAQs? They should be clean. They should be updated. They should be readily available so that you can, after you do a product demo, you quickly send the recap of the demo with a whole bunch of different product specs. For instance, it's all there, available in the CRM, easy for reps to do. So there's no friction to the sales process, okay? The other thing is, after you map your sales process, you can start to see what's winning and what's losing. And you can create playbooks for each stage, what to say, when to say it, how to respond to common objections, how to qualify a deal, that sort of stuff. Now, we are in a data-rich environment. So, as you're doing these types of calls, this stuff can be recorded. It can be fed into AI that can analyze it and come up with the playbooks for you. Use the data, the real-time data that you can then learn from and continue to optimize. So, for myself, I'm taking my successful calls, the last 50 successful sales, and then the last 25 failed sales, and I'm feeding it into AI to get commonalities as to what I did right, what I did wrong, and then I can update my playbooks accordingly. Okay? Because if you don't have this stuff documented and you're not obsessive about optimizing and improving, what you'll end up having, if you have 5 reps, you have 5 different sales processes. And each stage will be executed differently. So you got to get tight on this. You got to get distinct, and you really need to define what has to happen and support them with the sales collateral, the sales playbooks that can continue to standardize your sales process. Now, you got to have a CRM. This is non-negotiable, and this sales process has to live within the CRM. Each stage could trigger automations as the things they have to do to update the deal and that sort of stuff, right? Task reminders, email sequences, data logging, all that stuff has to be in there so that you can really, truly inspect the deals when you're acting as a sales manager down the road. The secret weapon for your organization has to be defined. Now, this comes down to your sales and marketing. People say they often don't work together, but this is what sales needs from marketing. It needs a very strong, defined point of view. Why should people be doing business with you? And so, it could be as simple as one of our folks was a short line manufacturer, and it's like, our equipment keeps you in the field, not in the shop. And so what they're pushing is the quality, the lack of maintenance required to use their equipment. That's their point of view. And that helps support the reps in the selling process and gives them things to talk around. And there's a lot of things that come out of that. You can say, well, just listen, if you don't have any downtime, here's why our equipment is at this price point versus the other stuff that has a lot of downtime. You can correlate it. It gives you assets to help in your sales conversations and your talking tracks. Okay, so we've talked about the sales process. We've talked about the things needed to support the sales process. Now, you've heard me a couple times talk about force and friction. Okay, so when you're looking at your sales process, you want to look at ways in which you can accelerate the deal velocity. So what can you do to apply force to your sales process? So a good example of applying force is scarcity. If you don't buy now, the discounts, the early booking discount will go away. That's applying force. You know that. You've got a deadline in there. Most manufacturers have some sort of program like that, but the tactic is force. But at times, you also want to have some friction in your sales process. And so what that could be is that you have a certain amount of lead time. And so you say, listen, you have to book now, because if you don't book now, you won't be able to get your product in time. That's friction. Lead time is an example of friction. You need to know as a sales team what you have at your disposal, these tools and techniques that can apply force and friction and use them to your advantage. And be aware of them, because sometimes friction is friction and you can't do much about it. Or you want to work on, hey, we need to remove this friction. It's stopping sales. So you got to be able to identify those different pieces and identify how you can actually speed up the sales velocity, the deal velocity. How can we apply force, and think through those types of things? So force and friction, what drives momentum, urgency, it's insights, offers, that sort of stuff. And friction slows things down. If it's taking too long to get a quote out, stuff like that, that's friction. You have to look at all those different elements to understand what's going on in your sales process, where you can apply force when needed, where you can reduce friction, or how you use friction to your advantage. Okay, so we've gone through all the steps. So what's the checklist when you're thinking about this? Okay, first, your revenue model. You've got to know what your revenue model is. Then you have to layer that with a sales model. You now have to understand your methodology that you're going to use within your sales process. You have to have clear stages, entry and exit criteria. You have to have a buyer-centric design. You have to have visibility within your CRM, and you have to have a whole bunch of support tools, playbooks, collateral, messaging, and then know how to strategically use force and friction. This is what we support people building as we help create their revenue factory. This is what every team needs to be able to scale efficiently. So if you've made it all the way to the end, you're clearly interested in knowing how to improve your sales process. Let me be clear. If your sales process isn't inspectable, it is not scalable, and if it isn't tied to buyer behavior, you don't have a growth engine. All you have is a guess. You build this process like a production line, tight, structured, supported. If this resonated and you want a full audit of your sales process, connect with me, send me a message. Happy to jump on a call and start to talk through what it is that you might need. If you've liked what you heard, go to weareroadmap.com/podcast. You can download the Revenue Factory Toolkit. There you'll get mathematical models and a deck with all this information to help you understand what you need to do to start building your go-to-market system. Also, subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts, and please leave some positive comments so the show grows. We have new episodes dropping the first and the third Wednesday of every month. I'm Steve Whittington. Thank you for listening. keep building your revenue factory one brick at a time.